Welcome everyone to this webinar. Good morning to people in the Netherlands. Good afternoon to people in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. I'm not sure what time it is. Good night, people in the US, Australia, perhaps. Welcome to this webinar in the Indonesia Social Science webinar series, or IS4, which is convened jointly by the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the Cornell Southeast Asia Programme, and my own institute, the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, or KITLV, in Leiden. And we are very honoured today with the presence of Michelle Miller of the National University of Singapore. So welcome, Michelle, who will be speaking about climate change mitigation and the politics of low-carbon peatland partnerships in Indonesia. I have the pleasure to have known Michelle for some time. We share an Aceh connection, which is always a special thing. You may or may not, you should actually know her 2009 book, Rebellion and Reform in Indonesia, Jakarta's Security and Autonomy Policies in Aceh. And ever since, she has worked not only on security and conflict resolution, but also on disaster governance, on various issues related to environmental commons, and more recently on climate governance and carbon sinks in Southeast Asia. And it is within the contours of that research program that she will be talking to us today. Michelle is an incredibly innovative and prolific researcher, and I'm extremely happy that she said yes to our request. I could say much more, but I won't, because we need to save the time for you, Michelle. What I should say is that we are also blessed with an equally fabulous discussant in the person of Bart Berenschot, who also happens to be my colleague at KITLV, a social scientist who works on the intersection of political science and anthropology, and who has worked extensively on violence, conflict, clientelism, elections in relation to various societal and political transformations in South and Southeast Asia. My name is David Kloos. I work at KITLV, and on behalf of the IS4 team, I will be your moderator. Behind the scenes, we have Yaya Sigars from KITLV and Ariane Dufresne from Sydney, who've been doing amazing work to keep us on track and to make the online platform do what it's supposed to do. So also a shout out to them. On a practical note, Michelle will be talking for about 30 minutes or so, I think. Then we have time for Q&A, hopefully about 25 minutes. I should stop talking here. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box, and then I will read them to Michelle. Please keep them short and to the point. I probably won't be able to read, we won't be able to discuss all of them due to time constraints, so I apologize in advance to those who miss out. I'm sure there will be other opportunities. You could contact Michelle if there's, I'm sure if there's issues you want to discuss after this webinar. I think this is all from me. I hope I didn't forget anything. I really look forward to this talk and to the discussion. Thanks both of you for being here. And now the Zoom room is yours, Michelle.
Thank you so much, David. That's a lovely introduction. And thank you also to Ward for agreeing so kindly to be my discussant today. It's an honor to join you, and happy to talk about my research today. The topic that I'm going to be talking about forms part of a new 5-year grant that we've recently been awarded at the Asia Research Institute. And that's on climate governance of nature-based carbon sinks in Southeast Asia. It will run until 2027. And you can see our logo up here in the top left-hand corner, Carbon Exchange for Southeast Asia. We're currently in the process of trying to hire a research fellow who does work on peatland governance in Southeast Asia. So if anyone knows of anyone who's interested, then please do feel free to share my contact details with them. I'm trying to make my slide go to the next slide. Ah, yes, right. What are carbon sinks and why do they matter? A carbon sink is anything that stores more carbon than it releases into the atmosphere. And carbon sinks are vital for keeping carbon dioxide at manageable levels in the atmosphere, and they absorb more carbon. They store carbon stocks to prevent greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming and climate change impacts. Peatlands are the largest soil carbon sink in the world, and despite covering only 2.3% of Earth's total land surface, Indonesia has the most and the largest area of carbon sinks in Southeast Asia, containing around 55 to 57 billion tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of almost 2 years of global carbon emissions at existing rates. But sinks can very easily shift to become sources of carbon emissions. And this diagram on the right here shows that when peatlands are drained and converted for agricultural use in particular, they become highly flammable. So in Indonesia, where peatlands have been drained extensively and on a large scale since the 1980s, for the planting of oil palm in particular and acacia plantations for pulpwood production, the burning of biomass from these sinks has become a major source of transboundary haze pollution, known in Southeast Asia as haze. So with the growing valuation of carbon-rich ecosystems as nature-based climate solutions, a contentious geopolitics has emerged surrounding the sink label. Often, local community interests and value perspectives about natural resources within carbon sinks become subordinated to international scientific climate agendas in carbon projects. And these sometimes assume that natural ecosystems are nothing but sinks, devoid of other values and functions. All carbon projects, no matter how well they're managed, also generate at least some negative externalities, like displaced carbon emissions or local livelihoods from designated conservation areas. And because these cross-border dimensions of carbon sink governance tend to be downplayed or overlooked in carbon projects that only focus on the area within the project boundary, this is going to be the main focus of my presentation today. So in carbon projects, scale is socially reproduced through project boundaries, which are the primary means by which carbon sinks are rendered political. Governments and privately owned agribusinesses, and to a lesser extent societal groups, invoke these scalar politics to delimit the boundaries of their own responsibility for emissions, to explain environmental transformations that fall outside their jurisdictions or areas of expertise, and also to absolve responsibility for carbon leakage to other areas. Conversely, when carbon projects prioritize economic or social goals over ecological criteria, they add to dry season flammability that causes haze pollution. So these sorts of cross-border dynamics shape real-world social and environmental outcomes that are rarely factored into the design of peatland carbon projects, and they're very difficult to capture or count within project boundaries because they exceed them. Riau province has become a focal point for national experimentation in peatland carbon projects because it contains 20% of Indonesia's total peatlands and 60% of Sumatra's peatlands. Peatlands cover around 50% of Riau's surface area, although almost 2 million hectares of these lands have been drained or cleared for agricultural conversion into plantations since the early 1980s. And with the area expansion of these plantations, Riau's peatland communities have become spatially marginalized and often socio-economically disenfranchised. And wildfires have increased substantially alongside these transformations, with over 400,000 hectares of land burnt in Riau between 2015 and 2019, the vast majority of which occurred in peatlands. So amidst these transformations, competing valuations of the protective and productive functions of peatlands have placed Riau at the epicenter of accumulating tensions between the Indonesian government's climate mitigation agenda and national development pressures. And I'll show how these tensions play out in the coming session by explaining how 3 types of peatland partnerships have made partial attempts to address climate challenges in Indonesia by articulating objectives to integrate sustainable forms of development with carbon sequestration. So here I'm drawing from research that's co-produced with Prayoto Tanoto, a hydrologist based in Riau, and David Taylor, a physical geographer here at the National University of Singapore. And you can see the publication details below. The map is created by Poonam Saxena Taylor, and it shows the boundaries of each of our carbon partnerships that we studied. It also shows the district borders and other carbon project boundaries that intersect them, and the relative depth and extent of peatlands. And all of these factors combine to shape the governance of the peatlands within the project boundaries. So we've compared 3 types of partnerships based on first, a multi-stakeholder partnership that involves the full range of peatland stakeholders within a district level jurisdiction of SIAC. Second, a bilateral partnership between the governments of Indonesia and South Korea. And third, a grassroots-driven partnership in Riau that uses international funding to implement local programs. And there are 3 of these examples that draw from International Climate Change Trust Fund funds in Riau. So the first type of carbon project is framed within the borders of Siak Green District. And those of you familiar with peatland governance in Indonesia will know that there's political tensions between this type of jurisdictional boundary approach and the landscape or ecological approach taken by the Peatland Hydrological Unit, which provides the legal basis for implementing a whole of ecosystem approach using natural water bodies like rivers and the ocean to establish boundaries of peatland governance. So the main problem with the Peatland Hydrological Unit is that it lacks the political, administrative, and economic powers that decentralized district level jurisdictions possess in Indonesia, such as SIAC district administration. Indonesia's local governments are also, by and large, much better networked to deal with private businesses and the interests of societal organizations than other scales and units of governance. So they're able to work toward negotiated solutions over much longer timeframes with the full diversity of stakeholders. And the problem with this, of course, is that because local governments are beholden to the full range of stakeholder interests, they often prioritize societal and ecological goals over environmental objectives. And also, unlike the peatland hydrological units that use natural water boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries inevitably introduce artificial barriers like fences and roads and different land use regulations that partition or block the natural flow of water and other resources across peatlands. And this in turn degrades certain ecosystem services and functions, and that sets into motion transboundary effects that remain largely unknown and unrecorded. So SIAC District's Green Vision was initiated in 2016 following the chronic haze episode in Southeast Asia in 2015 that negatively impacted around 43 million people in the region and released over 1.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So because some of the worst fires occurred in peatlands in SIAC, district authorities wanted to prevent a recurrence of haze pollution there by working collaboratively with civil society organizations and plantation owners, especially in the palm oil sector, by initiating more sustainable production methods. And as you can see in the bottom graph, since 2016 at least, SIAC has been relatively successful in reducing its fire hotspot prevalence relative to other districts in Riau. In large part, this success can be attributed to the willingness and ability of SIAC authorities to attract private sector funding and to mobilize multi-stakeholder support. They've done this by undertaking numerous rounds of negotiations and by incentivizing private businesses and smallholders to adopt fire-free practices within their concession boundaries. So SEAC's jurisdictional boundary approach has yielded both positive and negative externalities. On the positive side, SEAC Green District has been able to promote itself nationally and internationally as a model of best practice by participating in various autonomy expos. So by self-promoting and attracting popular legitimacy in this way, SEAC administrators have been able to encourage private companies to invest in low-carbon peatland initiatives at the district level. And inclusive development models are always more likely to be scaled up. So, for instance, SEAC's former two-term regent, Swamsar, pictured here on the right in the centre, used his role as the principal architect of the district's green vision as the cornerstone of his successful 2019 gubernatorial campaign to transform Riau province into a green province. Also, because SEAC district used jurisdictional boundaries to coordinate a community-based fire forest management system, this scale can be easily replicated in other districts that have similar societal and ecological characteristics to Riau. More negatively though, all growth-based models of development inevitably displace some amount of carbon to other areas outside project boundaries. And SEAC's fire management regime has also been criticised in other literature for emphasising the monitoring and the fighting of fires rather than building social awareness about the underlying causes of biomass combustion. And that in turn highlights the risk that this problem of lacking social awareness could be replicated in other contexts. So our second type of partnership takes the form of a bilateral carbon partnership between the donor government of South Korea and the Indonesian government as the recipient country. A key advantage of bilateral carbon partnerships is that they boost the capacity of recipient countries to implement environmental programs in areas that often lack sufficient resources, technologies, or areas of expertise. And this in turn enhances the soft diplomatic power of the donor country, both within the recipient country, but also within regional level bodies like ASEAN. And through green investments like REDD+, donor countries can protect their business interests in the receiving country. So the top-down approach taken by bilateral arrangements can increase the consistency in application of carbon schemes like REDD+ in implementation in peatlands. And that's also seen to be an advantage that can, in terms of its replication elsewhere. But set against these advantages, the hierarchical organizational structure often alienates local communities. And when such top-down partnerships lack local legitimacy, they tend to be short-lived, and that can result in transboundary problems of impermanence, displaced livelihoods, future carbon loss, and the displacement of emissions to other areas. And as our second case study will demonstrate, when donor country funds are channeled through the business sector, they can lead to problems of greenwashing, which produces negative social and environmental externalities that are felt well beyond project boundaries. So here's our second case, and it's bounded in yellow down here on the map. The South Korea-Indonesia FMU REDD+ joint project. The forest management units are the smallest unit for managing forests in Indonesia. And this project aimed to enhance the capacity of these units and the implementation level of Indonesia's forestry sector to reduce emissions through REDD+ activities. And the nature of these activities were undertaken inside unlicensed plantations where the owners lacked the full set of requisite permits. So the Indonesian Korean conglomerate called Korindo was the implementing partner for the second part of the project. And Corindo financially supported the attainment of the verified carbon standard. That's the world's most widely used voluntary emissions reduction certification scheme. So according to project representatives in Riau, the partnership's top-down approach was necessary in order to maintain consistency in the Korean government's REDD+ activities at all scales of climate governance in Indonesia. And at the regional level, South Korea's green carbon investments have enhanced its soft power and diplomatic stature in ASEAN. But with over half of the project's total budget constituting salaries that were paid to Jakarta-based consultants, there were insufficient remaining funds to implement REDD+ activities in Riau. And in this case, according to the people that we interviewed, the negative externalities outweighed the positive effects. So the potentially positive transboundary effects of this partnership were that in increasing the firefighting capacities of the forest management units, these improved capacities could then be developed beyond Riau, and they could be applied nationally to reduce transboundary haze pollution. But on the negative side, Corindo, which financed the project's completion, essentially reduced the partnership to greenwashing. And what it allowed Corindo to do was to promote itself as a national leader in conservation and human rights advocacy. And in this way, the publicly discredited business was able to minimize its other land use violations and human rights abuses in palm oil plantations that it has in other places in Indonesia, like North Maluku, Central Kalimantan, and Papua. And these excesses have been chronicled in a detailed report published by various environmental NGOs, and they've ranged from Corindo's systematic land grabbing and deforestation of primary forests through to its use of fire to illegally clear peatlands, and its co-option of Indonesian police to abuse the rights of traditional landowners and compel community compliance. So our third and final type of peatland partnership involves locally driven and internationally funded initiatives. The key advantages are that the place-based knowledge of nature can enhance sustainability because local communities have self-managed locally important resources for millennia to ensure food security and ensure successful and sustainable ecological outcomes. In many parts of Indonesia, the ecological knowledge of traditional communities also surpasses that of government agencies. Local participation and societal inclusion in turn brings popular legitimacy and perceived co-benefits like sustainable livelihoods, biodiversity, climate mitigation mechanisms at the local scale, and so on. And carbon projects that are locally seen as legitimate also tend to result in extended timeframes and extended budgets or top up in budgets. More negatively though, local communities can exploit funding opportunities for economic and societal goals that have nothing to do with the environment. And there is still, there's unequal power relations between communities, and donors can also restrict the range and means of environmental stewardship that are available to communities. And there's also a tendency among development sector actors in particular to romanticize the homogeneity and internal cohesion of communities, which often masks local tensions and politics. And this is a big problem, especially in REDD+ programs. So our third case involves three sub-projects that were implemented in Riau using Indonesia's Climate Change Trust Fund. And this agency was established in 2008 within the Ministry of National Development to support local climate mitigation innovations. So here are our three sponsored partnerships shown in aqua, pink, and orange on the map. And the first of these that was developed by the Riau Women's Working Group in Dumai district aimed to lead the gender mainstreaming of climate governance around peatland activities by actively integrating women into dam building and firefighting, polluter-culture or wetland agriculture, and catfish aquaculture. So even though its gender empowerment platform led this project to be declared and actively promoted nationally as a social success, in ecological terms, its outcomes have been quite varied. The second project, led by Riau University's Fisheries and Marine Science faculty, aimed to increase sustainable livelihood opportunities for peatland communities in the remote Meranti Islands. Like the Dumai Women's Working Group, this project's catfish aquaculture program failed, but it did succeed in planting mangrove seedlings to protect the boundaries of peatlands in that area. And our third project, led by Yayasan Mitra Insani, a peatland organization, was the only one of the selected carbon partnerships to take a jurisdictional approach, to take a landscape approach using the Peatland Hydrological Unit. And in this way, it crossed 2 districts. So although the Yayasan Mitra Insani was successful in raising public awareness about the need for an ecological approach to peatland governance, it ultimately suffered from a lack of coordination among key stakeholders. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but that contributed to the continuation of a series of negative externalities. As you'd expect, our community-based partnerships revealed that socially inclusive projects grounded in cultural capital are more likely to achieve political legitimacy that's necessary to be scaled up and out. So, for example, the Women's Working Group in Dumai successfully organized women's firefighting activities, and they have a strong tradition of female participation in all peatland community organizations in Riau, including the socialization of peatland activities. So this allowed their activities to be scaled up to the provincial level in Riau, but it's questionable about whether, or they may encounter obstacles in other parts of Indonesia where men dominate firefighting, for example. Partnerships that balance local livelihoods with ecological goals, like sago farming and re-wetted peatlands in the Meranti Islands, are also more sustainable because they incorporate pre-existing traditions like cultures of sago farming and consumption. And this in turn reduces transboundary effects of impermanence and leakage or carbon displacement. More negatively though, failed sustainability experiments like catfish aquaculture in 2 of the projects can destabilize subsistence economies, and they can displace traditional livelihoods, which trigger processes of economic migration. Illegal logging by local residents who obtained village forestry rights through the ICTF partnership also displaced environmental benefits that were accrued through mangrove and peatland replanting. And competing land use practices and poor coordination within some project areas can perpetuate wildfires, haze, and carbon displacement. So, for example, with the Yayasan Mitra Insani, one of their obstacles was that around 70% of the palm oil plantation owners within their area were not willing or able to communicate with them. A lot of them couldn't be contacted and actively avoided contact because they didn't have licensed plantations, and they'd only informally registered their plantations with village heads in the area. So what can be done to provide redress for some of these negative externalities? There's a tradition of active involvement by Indonesia's agrarian justice movement in transboundary environmental publics, especially around palm oil activism and biofuel activism. And they have European partners that have harnessed the purchasing power of high-profile animals like orangutans to resist unsustainable peatland conversion that drives emissions and displaces peatland communities and sustainable ways of life. And this example here that I'm showing took place in 2018. This person on the left here is the Lithuanian Penang-based street art activist, Ernest Zakarovic, who worked together with Indonesian activists to chainsaw the SOS image that you see in the bottom right here, Save Our Souls distress signal, into this Sumatran palm oil plantation. And through this land art installation, the artists collaborated with the UK-based Sumatran Orangutan Society, SOS charity, and the British cosmetics retailer Lush, which raised funds by selling limited edition orangutan-shaped soaps to buy the palm oil plantation on which the SOS installation was etched into the landscape. Occasionally, environmental publics use market environmentalism to appeal to ethical consumerism. They can influence supply chains in a greener direction. And a positive example of this can be seen in the Singapore-sponsored charity PM Haze, or the People's Movement Against Haze. And PM Haze tries to reform supply chains by implementing wet agricultural practices based on polluter techniques with peatland communities in Riau. And it promotes the ecological benefits of re-wetted peatlands and sustainably grown peatland products among school children in Singapore, like the SOS of Singapore, students of Singapore. And these students in turn connect with students like Kids Cut Palm Oil in Indonesia. Here in Singapore, PM Haze works with civil society consumers, agribusiness managers with headquarters in Singapore, and food retailers. And while this organization operates on a relatively small scale, it has achieved some public relations successes, including by persuading old Chung Ki and Polar Puffs, two popular local brands, to convert to using palm oil products by converting to the RSPO, or Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil certified products. So by way of conclusion, I'll return to the arrangements for governing these low carbon partnerships themselves. Even though all peatland partnerships are shaped and reconstituted by both positive and negative externalities, cross-border dynamics like carbon leakage and livelihood displacement are rarely factored into their design and the processes for planning and implementing them. So that's why I'm arguing that holistic approaches to peatland partnerships need to better anticipate these kinds of results that can't be easily counted or contained within project boundaries. And one way that peatland partnerships can minimize carbon leakage to other areas is prioritizing ecological success over utilitarian or strictly monetarized criteria for successful outcomes. In this, the administrative category of the peatland hydrological unit is designed to take such a whole of ecosystem approach, but it lacks real implementing power and resources in Indonesia, where most of the political and economic and administrative powers at the subnational scale remain firmly located within district governments. So further research is needed to show how successful cases might be scaled up, especially in space-constrained Indonesia, and how they can be extended beyond the limited timeframes of most peatland partnerships that are generally locked into fixed-term funding sources, making it difficult to extend the duration of successful programs. So boundary agencies like the recently renamed BRGM, the Peatland Mangrove and Restoration Agency, could also potentially play an important role in mediating the exchange of knowledge and coordinating diverse stakeholder interests and bridging capacity gaps at relevant scales of interest. And finally, I'll conclude just by noting that all of these transboundary challenges linked to peatland governance equally apply to mangrove ecosystems, which in Riau and in many other parts of Indonesia are often located next to peatlands. My colleague Prayoto Tanoto and I are currently exploring the social and ecological connections between these two types of carbon sinks. which share overlapping resources like fresh water, and they also share cross-border problems like palm oil mill effluent and other chemical pollutants that contribute to biodiversity decline. At present, the governance of mangroves is about 5 years behind peatland governance in Indonesia, but there's so much growing excitement about blue carbon in the region. And this means that mangroves are increasingly becoming integrated into the same sorts of governance arrangements as peatlands to search for climate solutions based on nature-based interventions. So this represents an opportunity, a major opportunity for the peatland hydrological units implementing power to be strengthened to apply a whole of ecosystem approach to governing both types of carbon sinks within a broader ecosystem, using broader ecosystem parameters. But unless cross-border dynamics like carbon loss and societal displacement issues are better factored into the design of carbon partnerships, then negative externalities are likely to continue to accumulate to the detriment of our collective well-being. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michelle, for that. Was a very rich and fascinating talk. We move straight to Bart for your comments and questions.
Yes, thank you, Michelle, for indeed a very interesting talk on a topic that is obviously of global relevance, as it is a way how we might be able to offset climate change, and these programs are, for many people, kind of a hope for the future. So in that sense, your analysis of how these programs actually work is very timely and important. I just, for the sake of time, but also for the sake of debate, I want to pick up two things. One is I want to depart from a comment that is on your third slide, where you say local interests are subordinated to international scientific climate agendas, which I think the comment, for example, you illustrate by saying how there's livelihood displacement, how people, their livelihood change, or people are moved because of these peatland restoration programs. But having heard your analysis and the story of these three programs, it made me wonder, isn't it also the case, the reverse, the case, that international scientific climate agendas are actually subordinated to local interests, in the sense that the implementation of these programs often fail, or at the very least not succeed in the way it was envisioned, because of local interests, because of, and that I would call, and that would be a question to you, kind of like the political economy of these programs and how they land on the ground, and how, as a political, when I studied politics in Indonesia, how these peatland programs are mind project. They are another project that can be played by local forces for income, for livelihoods, but more like money livelihoods. And I say this because I looked a little bit at a similar program in Kalimantan, the Kalimantan Forest and Climate Partnership, which was a partnership between Australian and Indonesian governments. So it falls under the second type of your programs. And it was a spectacular failure. It cost 35 million. The aim was to plant 100 million trees. And in the end, that is in 2012, only 50,000 of them were planted. Some for the reasons that you also mentioned, like no interaction with local communities, affecting their livelihoods. But it seems to me, but it's difficult to put the finger on it, there's also a lot of negotiating that the project actually turns out into paying salaries for planting and then siphoning off some money, and then the issue with land that is also being eyed for palm oil development. So there's business interests there that would like to prevent that replanting. So here I see an intersection basically between your and my research project, that there's this peatland redevelopment and restoration projects get sidetracked by basically local political economy, and then are not as effective as they could be. And then the second issue I want to raise is as a broader question. So you have the dispossession in your title of the plantation of the presentation, and you mentioned land grabbing. I just would like to know more on how this actually works, because these are areas, I think, that are often not whether they are being in use by communities as for agriculture or say rubber plantation. Well, I thought that they were just degraded forest lands, and that, for example, being replanted. So there would be no need for throw people off or to change the access to land on these areas. So but likely there is. So I would like you to expand a little bit on how that dispossession takes place and how extensive it is within these programs. So, and a third point, but that relates to the first one, but just very briefly, your focus is on the boundaries, on where the boundaries are. They're very political. I was wondering who's actually doing that, drawing these boundaries and making it political. Are we talking about the planners and the consultants in Jakarta here, who are involved in this, or are we actually talking? That is the link with my political economy point about on-the-ground processes of reshaping these boundaries and influencing them and saying, well, let's not keep these boundaries that were planned, but create some space for either local livelihoods or palm oil plantations and other business interests. So a little bit on that element. So these 3 points I'll make, and I'll stop.
Thanks a lot, Bart. Of course, I'll give Michelle, I'll give you the opportunity to respond. In the meantime, let me just tell the audience that you're welcome to pose questions as well. Please put them in the Q&A box. We should have time for a couple of questions after Michelle's response to Bart. Just note that I will prioritize questions over comments. Michelle, go ahead.
Great questions and comments. Thanks so much, Ward. For your first point about how it cuts both ways with scientific agendas being captured by local interests and how local interests become subordinated to scientific agendas, I think that I absolutely agree with you that a lot of REDD+ programs are just used for issues unrelated to the environment at the local level. They're often captured by local elites and used for programs where people do plant a small area of or undertake replanting, but then don't follow up with monitoring or additional care of transplanted seedlings, or there's a lot of problems with implementation that result from this disconnect. But something that I probably didn't mention is that a lack of knowledge and different values underpin this disconnect, because when REDD+ programs are implemented, often the donor is unaware of the local specificities of the environment or the politics, and that contributes to issues of displacement and leakage. And similarly, there's a tendency in carbon projects to privilege financialized knowledge systems, and monetarized carbon market valuations, and that displaces more than economic local ways of valuing nature that equally contribute to the well-being of peatland ecosystems. So I think behind the problem of misappropriation of resources or the capture of the political economy by one side or the other is the need to combine place-based knowledge with scientific knowledge in a much more integrated way in the design of programs. For the second point, how does land grabbing occur? I can give you an example from one of our interviewees who said that around election time, there's always more fires that are lit outside concession areas. So on the borders of peatland plantations, fires start to appear and then the boundaries of plantations can quietly expand during this time. So that's one way. Fires that are quietly lit, then people forget about them, they think it's degraded land and then move in. And the same happens with rainforests that are gradually eaten away through little fires. Who makes the boundaries? It depends in different cases. So in the case of Yayasan Mitra and Sani, they have different offices in various districts in Riau, and they were able to use their networks in 2 districts to work across the district boundaries of Siak and Pelalawan districts in Riau, the Peatland Hydrological Unit as the basis for their boundary setting. In Siak Green District, it was led by, so I think it's who leads the initiative and what kind of power they have to establish boundaries. So Siak administration was able to operate within its jurisdiction, and Dumai, the women's groups in Dumai were able to mobilize support from key villages to implement their programs there. In the case of the Riau University, they similarly approached different villages that were willing to participate in the program in the Meranti Islands.
Bart, quick response before I move to questions.
Well, no, I think they're just interesting questions, a limited time. So I think this is, I think it's interesting. I just to underline your point about place-based knowledge, one of the key things I think that these programs are naive about, I would emphasize, is the political economy and these local interests, that this element of the place-based knowledge that usually these outside designers lack. And then they're naive about how a project will work out.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions coming in. Michelle, would you like to take them one by one, or should I read a few? What's your preference?
Maybe one by one is.
So here's the first by anonymous attendee. Dear Michelle, I think the main cause of the displacement of communities is the structure and mechanisms of carbon market, which is biased towards selected stakeholders who have power, capital, and technology. The carbon credit market is not designed to include communities as a key player. What is your view on this?
Actually, I think carbon markets should be much more actively inclusive of local communities, and there are NGOs that are trying to facilitate the entry of peatland communities and mangrove communities into carbon markets, but the processes are very complicated, and the NGOs that there are environmental NGOs in Jakarta that offer training and support, technical support to enter markets, but it's still quite difficult for a lot of communities to fulfill all the paperwork to gain entry. And so it's kind of a missed opportunity from both sides, because there's a lot of companies that want to invest in carbon credits in various places, in peatlands and in mangroves in Indonesia, that are unable to because they're not side. And the process of certification, there are community-based certification methods, but they're not moving fast enough, and there's not enough support for them.
Thanks. I apologize for mispronouncing names, by the way. There's, if I do this, here's a question by Fadzila Majid Cook. I'm not sure whether that's the way to pronounce it. Thanks for your question. So this is the question, Michelle. If political economy is the context that affects action and processes on the ground, what is the context for the success of Women's Fire Brigade? Perhaps this activity is considered marginal to the political economy processes, such as control over land. What's your view on this?
So what's the context
What
for
is
this?
the context for the success of Women's Fire Brigade? This was one of your cases in the third type, I think.
Yeah, so for the Riau Women's Working Group in Dumai, they tried to introduce gender mainstreaming into firefighting activities, and the local context is very conducive for that in Riau, because women are involved in all aspects of peatland activities and the socialization of the need for firefighting, and they're also involved in firefighting. So according to our interviewees, they had a conducive cultural context for implementing firefighting activities. Now, could that be applied to a context elsewhere in Indonesia where men are the prime agents of firefighting? I mean, it could encounter obstacles if that initiative were to be scaled up. That said, the Dumai Women's Working Group, because of its gender mainstreaming approach to climate mitigation, has been hailed as a success. It's been widely promoted in Tempo. And so there's this socialization process of the importance of women's roles in climate mitigation. And as a result of this, some of the Dumai women's initiatives were integrated into Siak Green District's climate mitigation programs and its green vision.
Thanks. Another question by an anonymous attendee. Strengthening the peatland hydrological unit is essential. I assume essential to the success of the kind of projects that you've been discussing. But what is the best platform for managing PHU, or peatland hydrological unit, and how much would it cost, or what would be the costs? I assume economic costs, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that the peatland hydrological unit is seriously underutilized and needs to be strengthened to maximize ecological gains. I have no idea how much it would cost. And I think that the mechanism through which to do, there are a number of mechanisms that could be used to strengthen it. One is through the use of boundary agencies like the Peatland Restoration, Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency, working across district boundaries, and organizations like Yayasan Mitra Insani working across boundaries. But I think legislative power is needed by expanding the implementing power of the peatland hydrological unit in legislative terms, and that could be done by introducing incentives and regulatory mechanisms for ensuring compliance with adherence to a peatland hydrological unit model for partnerships in future.
That is clear. Here's another question by Payoto Tonoto. It's quite a general question. Many projects lack ownership and sustainability, and my question is how to make or how to create appropriate programs for local communities.
Well,
it does. No, go ahead. I might add something. But you first.
This is Payoto is much more knowledgeable about this than me. How to actually, that's I should say Payoto is my main co-author in Riau, and and we're trying to puzzle through this problem of how to extend and scale up successful examples and how to improve the inclusiveness and efficacy of partnerships. And so I'm not sure I have an answer for Payoto, because anything I say is going to be less than what he knows. And each partnership's always looking for ways to improve and has its own specificities.
Thanks, Payota, for the question. It's very modest of you not introducing yourself as being part of this research and part of this project. This is one of the disadvantages, I guess, of this format that we have. We cannot hear your voice, but thanks for the question anyway. Another one. Thanks for, this is also by an anonymous attendee. Thanks for such a rich presentation and for your in-depth analysis. Would you please explain how the Indonesian Peat Restoration Agency, or the BRG, fits under the peatland governance framework you've provided and how effective it is? And also, I'm not sure whether there's a separate question, but do the sustainability initiatives in the palm oil sector influence the curbing of the use of peatlands? To me, this comes across as two separate questions, but maybe that's my lack of knowledge of the.
Sorry, could you just repeat the first question, please? It was about the BRG.
The first question is, could you please explain how the Indonesian Peat Restoration Agency fits within the peatland governance framework that you have explained to us or provided?
Right. So the Peatland Restoration Agency has an expanded mandate now to include mangrove governance, and it facilitates all kinds of programs and trainings to improve sustainable development use of peatlands, and to so its premise across peatlands and mangroves is to restore, rehabilitate, re-wet and replant peatlands, and it works with various agencies, and it's a coordinating body.
Thank you. Then there was a second part of the question, which kind of goes back to some of the debate that we already had with Ward, but maybe you would like to comment a bit more. But to what extent sustainability initiatives in the palm oil sector have a direct impact on initiatives to curb the use of peatlands?
Well, the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, has introduced a number of criteria for more sustainable usages of peatlands, and some of these are legislated in Indonesia. Like there are zero burning practices in peatlands now, which are also in the RSPO, but people continue to burn peatlands, and the problem. So there is some adherence to the RSPO, but there's also a lot of cheaper palm oil products they don't need RSPO certification. So I would say that a minority of companies produce RSPO certified products still, and some of the practices that are seen as positive for sustainable peatland development and sustainable palm oil production are questionable. So, for example, peatland communities have a long tradition of safe and sustainable fire burning practices within their communities. Based on suitable wind and weather conditions, parameter setting, boundary setting, and burning inwards. This gets rid of excess debris that contributes to pests and increases the dry season flammability of properties. But with the blanket ban on burning of peatlands, that's arguably increased the risks of unsustainable palm oil production, especially among certain small holdings.
Thanks. Ward, would you like to chip in there as well? We are actually supposed to stop, but we started slightly later, so I'm taking 3 minutes more before we conclude. So I have one more question in the chat that I will do, but Ward, is there anything that you would like to add to this?
No, I guess this Michelle covered the impact that the criteria and principles like the RSPO have on curbing the use of peatland. And I think the key answer there is that there is a bit of left hand and not letting your right hand know what your left hand is doing. That there is palm oil companies agree to publicly stop burning, stop actually planting on peatland of certain depth, but it's still happening by particularly those not certified and the small ones, because there's also a big monitoring problem there that I would just add. Yeah.
There's a very nice question here, also from an unnamed attendee. I have a personal question. As someone born and raised in Pekanbaru, a city in the Riau province, in Riau, what can I potentially do to make an impact? How should I respond? Do you have some advice?
I maybe become involved in Yayasan Mitra Insani, or one of the peatland organizations that are so active already and that have in place programs in Riau. There are so many initiatives already in Riau that it might be a good idea to start by familiarizing yourself with some of the work that's being undertaken by people in your hometown.
Thanks. We should conclude. I have one final question myself, and it is in your one of your last slides, in your conclusion, your recommendation, there was this point where you said that we need to prioritize ecological outcomes or ecological aspects to measure the success of these projects. I understand that point from the viewpoint of everything you've said around greenwashing, measuring on the basis of maybe investments or other kind of business interests, obviously. Mm-hmm. But then we know from, for instance, the experience with nature conservation, that there's also a risk of measuring success on the basis of primarily ecological factors. It's very easy to overlook the livelihoods of local communities or rights. There's also land grabbing on the basis of green projects, right? So I'm curious: is there not a risk is there not that risk also in peatland restoration?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I agree with you. I think that there's got to be a balance between, and that's something that the BRG, the renamed Peatland Mangrove Restoration Authority, is really trying to do, is balance the protective and the productive functions of peatlands. But it's very difficult, and any kind of development, even sustainable development, results in carbon loss, but conservation on its own can result in livelihood loss and the displacement of development pressures. So the way forward, especially in a national context where land is increasingly scarce, and the reason why people moved on to peatlands in the first place is because of the lack of available mineral soil. And where over 10 million people are dependent on peatland livelihoods, that a way forward seems to be to try and monetize public environmental goods like carbon sequestration, polluticulture-based agriculture, but it's a tremendously difficult to strike that balance, and yeah, it's a challenge moving forward.
Yeah, well, that is very clear, but I think the research that you're doing in these programs that you're developing, this particular program, does go a long way in identifying those complexities and thereby really helping striking that balance. So great research, as Wart also said, of high societal and political relevance. I'm afraid our time is up. Thanks a lot, Michelle, for the engaging presentation. Thanks a lot, Ward, for your comments and for the points for debate. Thanks a lot to the audience and for the questions. There's also some comments still in the questions that, of course, I will share with you, Michelle. And with that, we should close. Thanks a lot, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David and Ward. Thank you.